Outbound in 1951 for her first load of iron ore, the Cliffs Victory joins the fleet of ore carriers on the Great Lakes. Converted from a deep-sea cargo ship in Bethlehem's Baltimore, Maryland yard, she became the first vessel of her size to traverse the Mississippi River and the Illinois waterway en route to Lake Michigan. Pennant of the Cleveland-Cliffs Steamship Company, the Cliffs Victory represents the culmination of an idea conceived by her owners in '50 to speed up the movement of iron ore from the mine storage bins down the Great Lakes to the steel mills during the season of open water. Mainly, the idea was that since the lakes lacked sufficient facilities for building more new ore vessels, a cargo ship already built but modified into an ore carrier could be navigated along an inland passage to the lakes at Chicago. Following a survey of the proposed delivery route by the shipbuilding division of Bethlehem Steel Company, its Baltimore yard undertook the conversion of a World War II Victory-type cargo vessel and its delivery to the Cleveland-Cliffs Steamship Company on the Great Lakes. On December 19, 1950, the original ship, the Notre Dame Victory, was towed from a Maritime Administration reserve fleet to the Baltimore yard, where she was docked for final acceptance survey by Cleveland-Cliffs Steamship Company. The Notre Dame Victory was built in 1945, one of more than 500 such ships constructed during the latter days of World War II. She had an overall length of 455 feet. In conversion, she was to be lengthened by 165 feet, giving her a new overall dimension of 620 feet. As a result of the survey of the route by which the ship would reach Chicago, it was found that the allowable height from keel to the highest point above decks could not exceed 53 feet 8 inches in order that the vessel might pass under low clearance bridges. Consequently, plans called for the removal of every part of the ship extending above this limit before the start of the voyage. The design of the ore carrier had been started the preceding month by Bethlehem's Baltimore yard, and the plans were approved by the owner, by the American Bureau of Shipping, and by the United States Coast Guard as the work progressed. To perform the conversion with the utmost speed, the new midship hull section, which would provide the added length to the vessel, was built at Bethlehem's Sparrows Point shipyard 10 miles away. Ocean-type hatch coamings were removed. The main or spar deck was redesigned and fitted with heavy transverse sections typical of Great Lakes ore hatches. 16 hatches in all were installed, 11 forward of the midship house and 5 aft. These spar deck transverses were assembled in units on the ground. Each consisted of the aft coaming of one hatch and the forward coaming of the next hatch, attached to the deck plating and the transverse girder. Shear strake and deck doublers of 1-inch plate were installed to provide additional strength to the lengthened hull. The streamlined stack was assembled on the ground and lifted aboard ship. A whole new forward deckhouse structure was erected aboard, its component parts having been pre-assembled. The steel shell of the pilot house was fitted to the top of the Texas deckhouse, which was finished aboard ship. The pilot house was removed for outfitting to speed the work. While the new midsection of hull was nearing completion at Sparrows Point Yard, the graving dock at the Baltimore yard was prepared for dry docking the ship and cutting her in half. When the dock was flooded, the gate was pumped out and floated clear. The ship was then brought in. The vessel was moved to the graving dock in the early morning, so she would be dry and ready for work when the day shift reported. A graving dock was chosen for the cutting and the first joining operation because of its solid bottom. After the ship had been moved into the dock, the water was pumped out, allowing the vessel to rest on the keel blocks. The blocks under the rising forefoot were wedged so that the vessel was evenly supported throughout her entire length. Timber guides for aligning the new section of the hull with the existing bow were built in the dock against the side of the vessel. Before beginning the girth cut, the bottom of the Notre Dame Victory was surveyed. Readings taken were used to check and maintain correct alignment of the old and new portions when they were joined together. The girth cut, which was preceded by the work already done above the deck line, initiated the actual transformation of cargo ship into ore carrier. The new hull section was joined to the bow portion, which remained in the graving dock during this operation. The stern section of the ship was then placed in the floating dry dock, where the newly lengthened bow portion was joined to it to complete the vessel. The line of the girth cut was between shell frames, forward of the midship house, clear of the machinery space, and in the parallel middle body of the ship. When the Notre Dame Victory was first dry docked at Baltimore Yard, mold locksmen templated the shape of the hull at the line where the cut was to be made. The new midship section, with the same full body cross section, was made to these measurements. The cutting operation, which was done mostly from inside the vessel, was completed in 7 hours. The dock was then flooded and the stern portion floated free. The bow, ballasted with water, remained in position on the blocks. As the stern was drawn toward the mouth of the dock, the widening gap showed how the cut was made through the longitudinal oar bulkheads, wing ballast tanks, and inside fore and aft passageway. The stern section was secured alongside a pier, and work continued on midship house quarters, oar holds, and the 5 aft cargo hatches. Boilers, turbines, and gears, and all engine room auxiliaries were completely overhauled, tested, and then operated during a dock trial. Meanwhile, construction of the new midship section was underway at Sparrows Point Yard. Inner bottom sections were installed on the bottom plating, which had been assembled on tables before being moved to the shipways. These members were of welded construction, as was the Notre Dame Victory itself. Plates and shapes were laid out, fabricated, and ground assembled for efficient handling. Units of the longitudinal bulkheads that formed the sides of the oar holds were erected on the completed inner bottom of the hull. Construction continued with the installation of the interior framing in wing ballast tanks, side shell plating, and the spar deck outboard of the longitudinal bulkheads. Assembly and installation of spar deck units and hatch combings, similar to those installed at the Baltimore Yard, followed. After finishing the exterior welding and painting, the work on the new hull section at the Sparrows Point Yard was concluded. The hull assembly was then launched and immediately taken in tow for delivery to the Baltimore Yard. For ease in joining the 3 portions of the hull, this 147-foot section was designed and built to allow for 2 9-foot spaces to be filled in between the new midship section and the bow and stern sections. These additions increased the length of the original hull by 165 feet. Safely across Baltimore Harbor, the new midsection was moved into the graving dock. The forward end was set in position against the timber guides, exactly 9 feet from the bow section. The units required to close this gap were also made up at the Sparrows Point yard. As soon as it was secured in the proper position, the dock was pumped out to allow the new section to settle along the timber guides and onto the keel blocks in perfect alignment with the bow section. The final alignment of the two sections was checked by means of a line which had been scribed on the deck of both sections parallel to the center line of the ship. A straight wire was set up over these scribed marks and squares used to make sure the established marks on deck were in line. Beginning with the bottom plating, the work of joining the two sections together progressed upward to the spar deck. Shell and deck doublers and gunnel angles were extended across the joint. These members were riveted their entire length in accordance with the requirements of the American Bureau of Shipping. Because of the length of the finished ship, 620 feet, it was planned to utilize the yard's 20,000-ton floating dry dock for the final joining of the stern and lengthened bow section. Moving past the skyline of downtown Baltimore, the stern section was towed from its mooring at the pier and placed in the dry dock. By this time, alterations on this portion of the vessel were nearly complete, and her profile had almost reached its final form. In dry dock, the stern portion was set on the keel blocks at the inshore end, where its position was checked. Then the dock was lowered to receive the forward section. The lengthened forward portion was then brought to the dock and placed in position over the keel blocks. Here again, allowance was made for a 9-foot space between the lengthened bow section and the stern. Timber guides were also used to align this section with the stern as the dock was being raised. As with the new midship section and the bow sections, hull structure units pre-assembled at the Sparrows Point yard were provided to fill in the gap. While the joining of the two sections was going on, final details were pushed to completion in every part of the vessel. The lengthened hull of the ore carrier was completed with the riveting in place of the last piece of gunnel angle. Lower down on the hull, the steel rubbing strakes, as well as the doubler plates around the discharge openings, were welded in place. To obtain the minimum draft required for the river passage, it was necessary to provide supplementary buoyancy at the stern of the vessel. So steel pontoons or blisters, each 120 feet long, were installed forward of the propeller aperture. The stack was completed and the masts were stepped and outfitted. Before departure, these parts were removed and stowed aboard the ship. On March 21st, 1951, just 3 months and 2 days after the arrival of the Notre Dame Victory at Bethlehem's Baltimore yard, the converted ship was ready for her rechristening. Attending these formalities were the sponsor, Mrs. H.L. Gobel, wife of the manager of Cleveland-Cliffs Marine Department, J.M. Willis, general manager of Bethlehem's Baltimore district, A.C. Brown, Cleveland-Cliffs president, Mr. Gobel, officers of the ship, the mayors of Cleveland and Baltimore, and other guests. Assisted by W.C. Reynolds, manager of the Baltimore yard, Mrs. Gobel renamed the Notre Dame Victory Cliffs Victory. Immediately after the christening ceremony was over, preparations for the voyage to Chicago were begun. Everything extending above the height limit line was removed so that there would be sufficient clearance between the ship and the bridges to be passed on the inland waterway route to the lakes. Tower cranes and a floating derrick were used to handle the heavier pieces of equipment. Propeller, and Rudder, which had been removed when the vessel was in dry dock, were stowed in number 1 hold. The Texas deckhouse, its interior completely outfitted, was removed from its place on the forecastle superstructure and secured on the spar deck. Likewise, the forecastle deckhouse and the pilot house were both stowed on the spar deck. The stack was cut in 2 horizontally. Each half of the outer stack was lifted separately and secured on deck, along with the inner stack. All other material necessary to complete the outfitting of the vessel upon her arrival at Chicago was stowed aboard. On April 2nd, 104 days after her arrival at Baltimore, the Cliffs Victory started her 3,000-mile journey by sea and inland waterway to the Great Lakes. Bethlehem's Baltimore Yard was responsible for the complete conversion of the Notre Dame Victory and her delivery as a finished ore carrier on Lake Michigan. Manned by a shipyard crew of 20 men and in tow of a seagoing tug, the converted vessel moved down the Chesapeake Bay, along the Atlantic coast, across the Gulf of Mexico, to the mouth of the Mississippi River on the first leg of her journey. After an ocean voyage of 16 days, the Cliffs Victory arrived at the Southwest Pass entrance to the Mississippi River. There, she was met by 3 tugs, sent down from New Orleans to assist in towing her up the pass against the strong river current. The upriver route followed the Mississippi to Grafton, Illinois, thence along the Illinois Waterway and through the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal to Lake Michigan. Moving steadily upstream, the tow arrived the following morning at New Orleans, 100 miles from the mouth of the pass, where it remained for 24 hours while preparations were made for the long trip upriver. The deep sea tug and a harbor tug towed the vessel while the other 2 harbor tugs assisted alongside. For the trip upstream, the Cliffs Victory was lashed alongside 3 barges in tandem, which were loaded to the same draft as the vessel. A Mississippi River steam towboat, secured at the squared stern of the last barge, propelled the Cliffs Victory all the way to Lockport, Illinois. In the early portion of the upriver voyage, the water level was such that at an even keel draft of 9 feet, the tow had both sufficient water under her keel for safe navigation and ample overhead clearance while passing under bridges. The Huey Long Bridge, just out of New Orleans, was the first of 122 bridges encountered on the 1,500-mile inland water journey to Chicago. In addition, the tow passed beneath 77 aerial crossings of various types and navigated through or around 9 locks. From sea level to Lake Michigan, the difference in elevation is 580 feet. Of this, 452 feet was overcome in the 1,180-mile push up the Mississippi River. The remaining 128-foot lift was made by means of locks in the 330-mile-long Illinois waterway. Bridges along the way became so many milestones in the pioneer voyage. As the unusual tow successfully passed one after the other, her progress was widely reported in the press and on the radio, stirring national as well as local interest, for this was the first time so large a ship had made this inland trip. The successful conclusion of this voyage demonstrated the feasibility of this inland route for future use. In the late afternoon of the 13th day after leaving New Orleans, the tow passed under the Chain of Rocks Highway Bridge above St. Louis, Missouri, successfully navigating this critical stretch of river. After locking through Alton at night, the tow left the Mississippi River at Grafton, Illinois, and began her trip through the Illinois waterway. High water flooded the lowlands in many places, which made it possible for the tow to bypass the locks at LaGrange and Peoria. Starved Rock Lock, as well as Marseilles Lock, were passed successfully, but the most critical phase of the trip came at the Marseilles Highway Bridge. From river measurements taken during the survey made prior to the vessel's conversion, this structure offered the minimum clearance between it and the ship. Actually, the tow passed beneath the span with less than 2 feet clearance between the lowest part of the bridge and the topmost part of the vessel's superstructure, and with about 3 feet of water under her keel. Bridge clearances all along the Illinois waterway were constantly checked by Bethlehem personnel in company with members of the United States Corps of Engineers. They moved ahead of the tow and reported clearances and changes of water level to those aboard by means of portable radio sets. After passing through the lock at Dresden Island, the tow arrived at Brandon Road Lock. All along the route, the tow was observed by interested spectators who crowded bridges and other vantage points. In some towns, school was dismissed so that the pupils could watch the tow in passing. Of all the locks traversed en route, not one was long enough for the entire tow to pass through together. The transit through these locks was therefore made in 2 operations. When the towboat had pushed the tow into the lock, the connection was broken between the second and third barge. The ship and the 2 barges were locked through together. After the towboat and the other barge went through, the tow was then reconnected. Here at Lockport, the last lock to be passed before reaching Chicago, the Cliffs Victory went through alone. The size of the lock made it necessary to swing the ship's stern to one side so that the miter gates could be closed. With Great Lakes diesel tugs now at bow and stern, the Cliffs Victory was ballasted to an even keel draft of 16 feet 8 inches to permit safe passage under the Sag Highway and Justice Highway bridges ahead. Here, the clearance approximated 2 feet between the undersides of the bridges and the topmost part of the ship. After these bridges were passed, the ship's draft was changed to 12 feet forward and 14 feet aft to lighten the vessel and give her some trim for better handling in close quarters while passing through Chicago. On the 37th day of her voyage from Baltimore, the Cliffs Victory negotiated the winding waterway through Midtown Chicago to arrive at the sanitary lock at Lake Michigan. Since her length exceeded that of the lock, she had to be pulled far enough ahead against the current caused by the 16-inch difference in water level until the downstream gates could be closed. She was then towed to the South Chicago yard of the American Shipbuilding Company, where the superstructure was reinstalled and the vessel made ready for service. A sheer leg derrick lifted and placed the forecastle deckhouse in position. Then, the Texas deckhouse was set in place. The ship was moved along and the stack reassembled on top of the midship house. Upon completion of these lifts, the ship was dry docked to permit the installation of the propeller and rudder. As soon as the pontoons were burned off, the hull was redressed, cleaned thoroughly, and painted. Meanwhile, passenger accommodations in the forward deckhouses were made ready. all work was carried on under the supervision of Bethlehem personnel. After completion of the dry dock work, the finished Cliffs Victory was moved out of the graving dock at South Chicago and moored in the Calumet River. Here, as a complete ship, her machinery was tested in a final dock trial. On Sunday, June 3rd, 3 weeks after her arrival at South Chicago, the Cliffs Victory, with her own officers and crew aboard, went down the Calumet River for her trial run on Lake Michigan. Casting off the last hawser, the fully converted vessel was on her own for the first time, becoming the first ore carrier of her type on the Great Lakes. Her 8,500 horsepower turbines drive the ship at over 20 miles an hour, making her the fastest vessel in lake ore service. Accepted by her owners and having left Chicago on June 4th, the Cliffs Victory, upon arrival at Marquette on Lake Superior, took on her first cargo of iron ore, 13,089 tons, for delivery to the unloading docks at Cleveland, Ohio. Appropriately, this Bethlehem converted vessel, owned by Cleveland-Cliffs Steamship Co, received her first cargo of ore from the Mather Mine, owned jointly by Bethlehem Steel Company and Cleveland-Cliffs Iron Company. The vessel arrived at Cleveland and moved into the ore dock to begin discharging cargo. This shipment was the first of nearly 500,000 tons of ore carried by the Cliffs Victory on this and subsequent voyages in 1951. To the men who conceived the idea behind the Cliffs Victory, and to those responsible for her conversion and delivery, the unloading operations came as a fitting climax to the venture. And following a tradition of the lakes, the captain of the ore carrier received from the owners his award for the delivery of her first cargo. With the ore loaded into cars for movement to Bethlehem's steel plant at Johnstown, Pennsylvania, the Cliffs Victory proudly takes her place in the lake ore service. Her conversion and delivery in 170 days stands out as a task well done, an outstanding example of American initiative and skill.